The morning sun cast long shadows across the training grounds as Captain Elena Vasquez adjusted her worn combat boots for what felt like the thousandth time. The leather had cracked in places, telling the story of countless missions that nobody seemed to remember anymore. She stood at the edge of the obstacle course, watching fresh recruits stumble through exercises she could complete blindfolded, their eager faces unmarked by the weight of real combat. "Look at the old-timer," whispered one of the young soldiers, thinking he was out of earshot. "They say she used to be something special, but that was years ago." Elena's jaw tightened, but she kept her eyes forward. At 34, she wasn't exactly ancient, but in military years, especially for someone stuck in a training facility instead of active duty, she might as well have been collecting a pension. The whispers had followed her for 3 years now, ever since the incident that had effectively ended her career in special operations. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was training soldiers for missions she wasn't allowed to join. Each day brought the same routine. Wake at dawn, oversee basic training, fill out paperwork, and pretend that pushing papers was as fulfilling as the covert operations that had once defined her existence. The brass had been clear about her new role. Valuable experience for training purposes, they said, but too much of a liability for active duty. She remembered the exact moment her career had shifted. A mission in Eastern Europe, classified details she couldn't share even in her own mind some days. Intelligence had been wrong, backup had been delayed, and when the smoke cleared, Elena had made a choice that saved civilian lives but went against direct orders. The medal they gave her afterward felt like a consolation prize, a golden handcuff that bound her to a desk job dressed up as honor. The recruits finished their morning run, breathing heavily as they gathered around for her daily briefing. Elena studied their faces, some cocky, others nervous, all of them believing they understood what warfare meant because they'd played video games or watched movies. She envied their innocence even as she prepared to shatter some of their illusions. "Combat isn't about being the fastest or the strongest," Elena began, her voice carrying across the assembled group. "It's about making the right decision when you have incomplete information and no time to think." She gestured toward the obstacle course. "These exercises teach your body to move, but real missions will test something deeper." A young recruit raised his hand, his uniform still crisp with newness. "Captain, what was your most difficult mission?" Elena paused, feeling the familiar weight of memories she couldn't share. "The ones where following orders perfectly would have meant innocent people died," she said finally. "Those are the missions that define who you really are." The training session continued with its predictable rhythm. Elena corrected stances, demonstrated techniques, and answered questions that seemed to come from a different universe than the one she'd operated in during her active years. By noon, the recruits were dismissed for lunch, leaving her alone with equipment that felt more like museum pieces than tools of war. She was securing the weapons rack when Sergeant Morrison approached, his expression unreadable. Morrison had served under her during the good years, and his presence at the training facility felt like another reminder of how far they'd both fallen from their former positions. "Captain, there's someone here to see you," Morrison said quietly. "Says it's official business." Elena frowned. Official visitors were rare at the training facility, and usually meant either budget cuts or new regulations designed by people who'd never held a rifle in anger. She followed Morrison toward the administrative building, noting the black sedan parked outside with government plates. The man waiting in the conference room wore a suit that cost more than Elena's monthly salary, and his posture suggested military background despite the civilian clothes. He stood when she entered, extending a hand that felt like he'd spent time gripping more than pens. "Captain Vasquez, I'm Director Thomas Harrison, Department of Special Operations." He settled back into his chair, pulling a tablet from his briefcase. "I've been reviewing your service record." Elena remained standing, her instincts warning her that this conversation would change something fundamental. "My record is hardly classified, sir. Pretty clear how it ends." Harrison smiled, but there was something calculating behind his eyes. "Actually, Captain, I'm not here about how your record ends. I'm interested in some details about how it began." He tapped his tablet, bringing up what looked like old personnel files. "Specifically, your recruitment into special operations 15 years ago." The mention of her early career sent a chill through Elena's chest. Those were files that should have been buried so deep that even she sometimes forgot the details. Her recruitment hadn't followed normal channels, and the reasons why were supposed to stay forgotten. I'm not sure what you're looking for, Elena said carefully. My early assignments were standard special operations training. Standard? Harrison's eyebrows rose. Captain, you were recruited at 19 directly from basic training, bypassed normal special operations selection, and within 6 months were running solo missions in regions that officially didn't exist on any map. He leaned forward. That's not standard by any military definition. Elena felt her mouth go dry. The missions Harrison was referencing had been conducted under such deep cover that she'd sometimes wondered if they'd actually happened or if they were elaborate training exercises. The targets had been real enough, and the consequences of failure had felt genuine, but the lack of paperwork afterward had always made her question the nature of what she'd been involved in. Those missions were need to know, Elena said, falling back on the standard response she'd been taught decades ago. And I was told the need to know had expired. Harrison nodded approvingly. Good answer. Shows you remember your training. He stood, moving toward the window that overlooked the training grounds. The thing is, Captain, the need to know is about to change dramatically. Elena joined him at the window, watching new recruits struggle through afternoon drills. From this height, they looked like children playing at war games, oblivious to the weight of what real combat demanded. She wondered if she'd ever looked that naive, that confident in the clear lines between right and wrong. There's a situation developing, Harrison continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper despite the empty room. International in scope, with potential consequences that could reshape global security. The people in charge need operatives with very specific qualifications. And what qualifications are those? Elena asked, though part of her already knew the answer. Harrison turned to face her directly, his expression serious. People who can operate without official support, who can make difficult decisions under pressure, and who have experience with missions that never officially happened. He paused, studying her reaction. People who understand that sometimes protecting innocent lives means disobeying orders. The reference to her career-ending decision hit Elena like a physical blow. For 3 years, she'd been told that her choice to save civilians over completing the mission had been a failure of judgment, a sign that she couldn't be trusted with important assignments. Now this stranger in an expensive suit was suggesting it might actually be a qualification. I'm assigned to training duties, Elena said, testing whether Harrison understood the reality of her situation. The Pentagon made it clear that my active duty days are over. Harrison smiled, pulling a sealed envelope from his jacket pocket. Captain, what I'm about to show you supersedes Pentagon authority. He handed her the envelope. Before you open that, understand that reading those documents will change your life. There's no going back to the simple world of training recruits and filing reports. Elena held the envelope, feeling its weight. The paper was thick, expensive, with watermarks she recognized from the highest levels of government authorization. Whatever was inside carried the kind of authority that could override careers, reshape military assignments, and possibly get people killed. Why me? She asked. If this mission is as important as you're suggesting, there have to be active operatives with better qualifications. Because, Captain, this mission requires someone who's already been declared dead. The statement hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Elena stared at Harrison, trying to process what he'd just said. She was very much alive, standing in a conference room at a military training facility, drawing regular paychecks and dealing with the mundane realities of daily life. Harrison seemed to read her confusion. Open the envelope, Captain. The first document should clear up any questions about your current status. Elena broke the wax seal and pulled out a thick folder. The first page was a death certificate, official government letterhead, signed by military officials she recognized. The name on the certificate was hers. The date was 3 years ago, and the cause of death was listed as killed in action during classified operations. Her hands shook as she read the document again, trying to understand how she could be looking at her own death certificate while standing in a room having a conversation. The signature belonged to her former commanding officer, a man she'd trusted with her life on multiple occasions. This is impossible, Elena whispered. I'm obviously not dead. Harrison nodded sympathetically. Officially, Captain Elena Vasquez died during the mission that ended your special operations career. The woman who's been training recruits for the past 3 years is someone else entirely. Someone whose identity we've been carefully maintaining for situations exactly like this one. Elena sank into a chair, the implications crashing over her like a tide. If she was officially dead, then everything about her current life was an elaborate fiction. The training facility, the recruits, even her apartment and bank account were all part of a constructed identity designed to keep a dead woman busy while someone else decided her fate. The question now, Harrison continued, is whether the woman in this room wants to stay dead and keep training soldiers, or if she's ready to discover why Elena Vasquez had to die in the first place. Elena looked up at him, seeing something in his eyes that she recognized from her active duty days. The look of someone who knew secrets that could reshape the world, and who was deciding whether to share them. Outside the window, recruits continued their afternoon training, oblivious to the conversation that was rewriting everything Elena thought she knew about her own life. She opened the folder again, noting additional documents beneath the death certificate. Photos of people she didn't recognize, coordinates for locations in countries she'd never visited officially, and what looked like surveillance reports dating back to her childhood. At the bottom of the stack was a single photograph that made her blood run cold. It was her family home, the small house in Texas where she'd grown up, but the photo had been taken recently. Her parents were visible through the kitchen window, going about their evening routine, unaware that someone had been watching them. A red circle had been drawn around a car parked across the street, with a notation in handwriting she didn't recognize. Surveillance active since 2021. Your family believes you died 3 years ago, Harrison said gently. They had a funeral, grieved your loss, and moved on with their lives. But someone has been watching them ever since, waiting for any sign that their dead daughter might still be alive. Elena felt the last pieces of her old life crumble away. The comfortable fiction of her training assignment, the predictable routine of working with recruits, the simple belief that her career had ended because of one difficult decision. All of it had been an elaborate lie designed to protect not just her, but the people she loved most. Who's been watching them? She asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Harrison closed his tablet and returned it to his briefcase. That, Captain, is why we need you to stop being dead and start being very much alive again. The mission that supposedly killed you 3 years ago? It wasn't actually completed, and the people who think they buried Elena Vasquez are about to discover that some soldiers are much harder to kill than they expected. Elena stood up, feeling something shift inside her chest like a gear clicking into place. For 3 years, she'd been living someone else's life, teaching other people to be soldiers while forgetting what it felt like to be one herself. But, looking at the surveillance photo of her family, seeing the evidence that her death had been a carefully constructed lie, she felt the familiar weight of purpose settling on her shoulders. What's the mission? She asked, her voice carrying the tone she'd used during her active duty years. Harrison smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression. To find out why someone wanted Elena Vasquez dead, and to make sure they regret not finishing the job properly. Elena closed the folder and stood up, feeling 3 years of comfortable fiction fall away like shed skin. Whatever came next would be dangerous, possibly deadly, and would require her to become someone she'd thought was gone forever. But, as she looked at the photo of her parents one more time, she realized that some things were worth coming back from the dead to protect. The afternoon sun was setting as Harrison prepared to leave, but Elena had one more question that had been burning in her mind since the conversation began. The emblem, she said quietly. You mentioned something about a secret emblem when you first contacted my supervisor. What does that refer to? Harrison paused at the door, his hand on the handle. Captain, during your early special operations career, you were marked with an identification that wasn't supposed to exist. Something that would identify you to certain people in certain situations as someone with very specific clearances and capabilities. He turned back to face her. Tomorrow, you'll understand exactly what that emblem means, and why seeing it again after 3 years is about to change everything. As Harrison left, Elena remained in the conference room, staring out at the training grounds where recruits were securing equipment for the night. Tomorrow, she would have to decide whether to remain a dead woman teaching soldiers or become Elena Vasquez again and discover why someone had wanted her eliminated badly enough to fake her death and watch her family for years. The choice felt inevitable, like standing at the edge of a cliff and realizing that jumping was the only way forward. Elena had been declared dead once, but something told her that the most dangerous part of her story was just beginning. Elena arrived at the coordinates Harrison had given her before dawn, driving through empty streets in a car she'd never seen before, but found keys for in her apartment mailbox. The address led to an abandoned warehouse district, the kind of place where official business happened unofficially. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary as she navigated between buildings that looked like they hadn't seen legitimate commerce in decades. The warehouse Harrison had specified sat at the end of a dead-end street, its windows painted black and no visible signs of occupancy. Elena parked next to the only other vehicle present, a military transport with plates she didn't recognize. The morning air carried the scent of rust and old concrete as she approached the building's single entrance. Inside, the warehouse had been converted into something resembling a briefing room. Folding tables formed a rough rectangle in the center of the space, surrounded by chairs that looked like they'd been borrowed from a dozen different offices. Maps covered the walls, showing regions Elena recognized from her active duty years alongside others that seemed to exist in the gaps between official geography. For people waited for her arrival, each representing a different branch of military or intelligence services based on their posture and dress. Elena recognized the type immediately: career professionals who operated in the spaces where normal rules didn't apply, people who solved problems that governments couldn't officially acknowledge existed. Harrison stood at the head of the table, looking more official in daylight than he had in the conference room. Beside him sat a woman in her 50s wearing the kind of tailored suit that suggested serious political connections, her silver hair pulled back in a style that said she didn't have time for appearance concerns beyond basic competence. "Captain Vasquez," Harrison began as Elena took a seat. "Meet Deputy Director Sarah Chun from the National Security Agency, Colonel Marcus Webb from Defense Intelligence, and Dr. Rebecca Stone from a research division you don't need to know the name of." Elena nodded to each in turn, noting how they studied her with the intensity of people evaluating a weapon for specific purposes. She'd been on the other side of such meetings before, assessing operatives for missions that required particular combinations of skills and psychological profiles. "Dr. Stone spoke first, her voice carrying the precise diction of someone accustomed to explaining complex concepts to people who made life-or-death decisions based on incomplete information. "Captain, we need to discuss the circumstances of your recruitment into Special Operations 15 years ago. Specifically, the medical procedures you underwent during your initial training." Elena felt a chill run down her spine. The medical procedures during her early training had been extensive, far beyond anything she'd expected for normal special operations preparation. Doctors had run tests she didn't understand, taken tissue samples for research they couldn't explain, and administered injections they claimed were advanced immunizations for deployment in hostile environments. "I was told those procedures were standard for deep cover operations," Elena said carefully. "Standard procedures don't typically include subcutaneous implantation of identification devices," Dr. Stone replied, pulling up what looked like medical imaging on a tablet, especially devices using technology that didn't officially exist at the time. The image on the screen showed what appeared to be an X-ray of a human torso, with a small object visible near the left shoulder blade. The device was roughly the size of a grain of rice, but even in the grainy medical image, Elena could see intricate internal structures that suggested sophisticated electronics. "That's inside me?" Elena asked, unconsciously reaching toward her left shoulder. Deputy Director Chen leaned forward, her expression serious. "Captain, what you're looking at is a prototype identification and tracking system that was developed for a highly classified program. Only 12 operatives were ever fitted with these devices, and, according to official records, all 12 died during various missions between 2015 and 2022. Elena processed this information, feeling pieces of a puzzle clicking together in ways that made her increasingly uncomfortable. If she was officially dead and carrying experimental technology that was supposed to have been lost with its other recipients, then her current situation was far more complex than a simple reactivation for a new mission. Colonel Webb opened a thick folder and spread several photographs across the table. Each showed a different person, but Elena could see similarities in their bone structure, posture, and the way they carried themselves that suggested similar training and background. These are the other 11 operatives who received the same implant as you, Webb explained. Each was recruited young, trained in similar protocols, and deployed for missions that officially never happened. And each one supposedly died under circumstances that left their bodies unrecoverable. Elena studied the faces, noting that none looked familiar despite their shared background. You're saying all 12 of us were selected for this program, but none of us knew about the others? Compartmentalization, Harrison said. Each operative believed they were unique, specially selected for capabilities that made them valuable for specific missions. The truth was more complex. Dr. Stone pulled up additional screens on her tablet, showing what appeared to be genetic profiles and psychological evaluations. The 12 operatives weren't selected randomly, Captain. You were chosen based on very specific criteria that included genetic markers for stress resistance, psychological profiles indicating ability to operate independently, and family backgrounds that could withstand extended separation. Elena felt like she was falling down a rabbit hole that kept getting deeper. Every answer revealed new questions, and each new piece of information made her former life seem more like an elaborate fiction designed by people whose goals she couldn't begin to understand. What was the purpose of this program? She asked, though part of her wasn't sure she wanted to know. Deputy Director Chun answered, her tone suggesting she was sharing information that could get them all killed if it reached the wrong ears. The program was designed to create deep cover operatives who could function independently for extended periods, who could be trusted with missions that had no official oversight, and who could be disavowed completely if circumstances required. Disavowed by faking our deaths, Elena said, the pieces falling into place. Only if necessary, Harrison clarified. The original plan was to maintain the operatives as assets indefinitely. But international circumstances changed, political priorities shifted, and the program was officially terminated 3 years ago. Elena looked around the table, noting how each person seemed to be carefully monitoring her reactions. This felt like an evaluation, a test to determine whether she could handle the truth about her own existence and still function effectively. If the program was terminated, why am I here? Elena asked. Colonel Webb pulled out what appeared to be intelligence photographs, showing locations that Elena recognized from news reports over the past few months. Each image was marked with coordinates and timestamps, creating what looked like a pattern of activity across multiple continents. Because 3 months ago, the tracking signals from the 11 supposedly dead operatives started activating again, Webb said grimly. All of them, simultaneously, for the first time in 3 years. Elena felt her blood turn cold. If the other operatives were activating tracking devices that had been dormant since their supposed deaths, it meant they were either still alive and recently became active again, or someone else had gained access to technology that should have been buried with them. Are they alive? Elena asked. Dr. Stone shook her head. We don't know. The signals are genuine, coming from the actual implants, but we have no way to determine whether the original operatives are controlling them or if someone else has acquired the devices through other means. Elena studied the photographs Webb had spread across the table, noting that the locations where signals had been detected included several cities where major international incidents had occurred recently. The timing wasn't coincidental. Someone was using the tracking devices to coordinate activities that were having global consequences. What kind of incidents? Elena asked, though she suspected the answer would be disturbing. Harrison pulled up news footage on a large screen that had been wheeled into the warehouse. Elena watched reports of industrial accidents that had disrupted global supply chains, terrorist attacks that had somehow avoided all security measures, and political assassinations that had been carried out with impossible precision. Each of these events occurred within 48 hours of tracking signal activation in the same geographic area, Harrison explained. Either the supposedly dead operatives are carrying out a coordinated campaign of global disruption, or someone is using their identities and technology to conduct operations that can be blamed on a terminated program. Elena realized that her own situation was far more precarious than she'd understood the previous day. If she was the only one of the 12 operatives who hadn't started transmitting signals, she was either the last uncompromised asset or the only one who hadn't yet been activated for whatever mission the others were pursuing. My tracking device, Elena said, reaching again toward her left shoulder. Is it active? Dr. Stone checked her tablet, scrolling through what appeared to be real-time monitoring data. Your signal has been dormant since your official death 3 years ago, which is why we were able to maintain your cover identity. But, Captain, there's something else you need to understand about the technology inside you. Elena waited, sensing that whatever Dr. Stone was about to reveal would be the most important piece of information yet. The implants weren't just tracking devices, Dr. Stone continued. They were designed to monitor and potentially influence neurological activity. In extreme circumstances, they could be activated remotely to trigger specific behavioral responses in the operative. The warehouse fell silent as Elena processed this information. The device in her shoulder wasn't just monitoring her location. It was potentially capable of controlling her actions without her knowledge or consent. She thought back over the past 3 years, wondering how many of her decisions had been truly her own and how many might have been influenced by remote activation. Are you saying I could be controlled like a robot? Elena asked. Colonel Webb shook his head. Not controlled exactly. The technology can influence decision-making processes, heighten certain instincts, or trigger trained responses. But it requires the operative's existing neural pathways and training to be effective. Elena realized that her recruitment, training, and psychological conditioning had been designed to create someone who could be guided remotely while still believing they were making independent choices. The missions she'd completed during her active duty years took on new significance. Had she been following orders or following technological suggestions that felt like her own instincts? Deputy Director Chen leaned forward, her expression grave. Captain, we believe the other 11 operatives have been reactivated and are being controlled by someone who gained access to the program's activation protocols. The question is whether you're willing to help us find out who, and whether you can resist similar activation attempts. Elena stood up and walked to one of the maps covering the warehouse walls. The locations where tracking signals had been detected formed a pattern that suggested careful planning and coordination. Someone with access to highly classified technology was using supposedly dead operatives to conduct operations that were destabilizing global security. What makes you think I can resist activation when the others apparently couldn't? Elena asked. Dr. Stone answered, her voice carrying a note of professional excitement that seemed inappropriate given the circumstances. Because your neurological baseline has been different from the others since your original implantation. Your brain showed unusual resistance to the conditioning protocols, which is why your missions often deviated from exact orders. Elena turned back to the table, understanding dawning like a cold sunrise. Her tendency to make independent decisions, the choices that had supposedly ended her career, weren't character flaws or training failures. They were signs that the technological influence hadn't worked properly on her. My decision to save civilians instead of completing the mission, Elena said slowly. That wasn't defiance of orders. That was resistance to technological influence. Harrison nodded. Which is why your death had to be faked. Someone realized that you couldn't be controlled reliably, so you became a liability to whoever was planning to use the program for their own purposes. Elena sat back down, feeling the weight of everything she'd learned settling on her shoulders like a heavy coat. She'd been recruited as a teenager, trained and conditioned to be the perfect operative, fitted with technology designed to ensure her compliance, and then discarded when that technology failed to work as intended. But now the people who discarded her needed her resistance to that same technology to stop whoever was using her former colleagues for purposes that threatened global stability. The irony would have been amusing if the stakes weren't potentially catastrophic. What's the mission? Elena asked, falling back on the familiar comfort of specific objectives and clear goals. Colonel Webb spread additional photographs across the table, showing what appeared to be military installations and government buildings in various countries. We need you to make contact with the activated operatives and determine whether they're acting under their own will or technological compulsion. If it's compulsion, we need you to disrupt their operations and trace the activation signals back to their source. Elena studied the photographs, noting that several showed locations she'd operated in during her active duty years. And if I encounter one of the other operatives? Then, you'll discover whether your resistance to technological influence extends to combat situations, Dr. Stone said grimly. Because if they've been activated for hostile operations, they'll likely view you as a threat to be eliminated. Elena realized that accepting this mission meant potentially fighting people who'd undergone the same training she had, who carried the same technological implants, and who might be acting against their will under technological compulsion. It would be like fighting distorted versions of herself, people who represented what she might have become if the conditioning had worked properly. But the alternative was allowing whoever had gained control of the program to continue using her former colleagues for operations that could destabilize governments, collapse economies, or start wars. The technology inside her shoulders suddenly felt heavier, like a weight that had been pulling her down for 15 years without her realizing it. "I'll need equipment," Elena said, accepting what felt like an inevitable choice. "And I'll need to know everything about the other operatives, their training, their specialties, their psychological profiles." Harrison smiled, but there was no satisfaction in the expression. "Captain, everything you need has been prepared. But understand that once you begin this mission, Elena Vasquez will be truly alive again, and there's no guarantee that any of us will survive long enough to see how it ends." Elena stood up, feeling something shift inside her chest like machinery awakening after a long sleep. For 3 years, she'd been playing the role of a dead woman, teaching others to be soldiers while forgetting what it meant to be one herself. But looking at the evidence of her former colleagues' activation, seeing the global consequences of their missions, she realized that some fights were worth coming back from the dead to finish. "When do I leave?" she asked. Dr. Stone closed her tablet and gathered her files. "Tomorrow morning. Your first target is in Berlin, where one of the tracking signals was last detected. But, Captain, there's one more thing you need to understand before you go." Elena waited, sensing that this final piece of information would be the most dangerous yet. "The person controlling the activated operatives knows you're alive," Dr. Stone said quietly. "They've been monitoring your location for the past 3 years, waiting for you to be reactivated. They know you're coming, and they're prepared for someone with your exact training and capabilities." Elena felt a chill run down her spine as she realized that accepting this mission meant walking into a trap that had been 3 years in the making. But as she thought about her parents under surveillance, her former colleagues being used as weapons, and the global consequences of allowing the program to continue operating outside official control, she knew that some traps were worth walking into. The question wasn't whether she could complete the mission. It was whether she could do it before whoever was controlling the other operatives used them to accomplish something that would make her resistance irrelevant. Elena Vasquez had been declared dead once, but she was beginning to understand that staying alive this time would require fighting not just her enemies, but potentially the technology inside her own body. The flight to Berlin gave Elena 12 hours to study the files Harrison's team had provided, and each page made her mission seem more impossible. The operative she was tracking, designated Subject 7 in the original program documents, had been trained in urban warfare and surveillance techniques that matched her own capabilities. More troubling, his psychological profile suggested someone who would be extremely difficult to approach without triggering defensive responses. Elena's cover identity was solid but simple, a freelance security consultant attending a technology conference in Berlin. The credentials would hold up under casual inspection and provided reasonable justification for her presence in areas where Subject 7's tracking signal had been detected. Her equipment had been integrated into normal business items: laptop with hidden communication gear, briefcase with concealed weapons, and a smartphone that could detect the same tracking frequencies the operatives' implants used. Berlin's Tegel Airport felt like every other international terminal Elena had passed through during her active duty years, full of travelers who moved with purpose toward destinations that mattered more than the journey. She cleared customs without incident and took a taxi to a hotel in the Mitte district, near where Subject 7's signal had last been recorded. The hotel room was standard corporate accommodation, anonymous and functional in ways that suited Elena's needs perfectly. She unpacked methodically, arranging her equipment and studying street maps of the surrounding area. Subject 7's signal had been detected intermittently over the past week, suggesting either careful operational security or technological problems with his implant. Elena spent her first evening in Berlin walking the streets where the tracking signals had originated, getting familiar with the neighborhood's rhythm and identifying potential surveillance positions. The area was a mix of office buildings, restaurants, and small shops that catered to both tourists and local business people, perfect for someone who needed to blend into urban crowds while conducting operations. On her second day, Elena established a routine that would let her monitor the area systematically while maintaining her cover as a conference attendee. She spent mornings in hotel coffee shops with clear views of major intersections, afternoons walking routes that connected the signal detection points, and evenings in bars and restaurants frequented by international business travelers. The conference she was supposedly attending proved useful for more than just cover. The technology companies presenting there included several that specialized in security systems and surveillance equipment, giving Elena opportunities to gather information about advances in tracking technology while appearing to conduct legitimate business research. It was during one of these conference sessions that Elena first felt the familiar prickle of being watched. The sensation came during a presentation about biometric identification systems, a creeping awareness that someone in the audience was paying more attention to her than to the speaker. Elena had learned to trust these instincts during her active duty years. They'd saved her life more than once. She didn't turn to look for her watcher immediately. Instead, Elena waited for a natural break in the presentation to glance around the auditorium, noting faces and positions with the practiced efficiency of someone trained in threat assessment. Most of the audience looked exactly like technology professionals should, focused on the presentation, taking notes, occasionally checking their phones for messages. But, in the third row, Elena spotted someone whose presence made her blood run cold. The man appeared to be in his early 30s, with the kind of carefully maintained physical conditioning that suggested military background. His posture was too alert for a civilian conference attendee, and his eyes moved with the systematic scanning pattern Elena recognized from her own training. What made her heart race was the partial view of a small scar on the man's left shoulder blade, visible above his shirt collar. Elena knew that scar pattern because she had an identical one, the mark left by surgical implantation of the tracking device that had defined her entire adult life. Subject 7 was sitting 20 feet away from her, apparently attending the same conference session, and, from his alertness level, Elena suspected he'd already identified her as well. The question was whether his presence was coincidental or if he'd been hunting her as actively as she'd been searching for him. Elena forced herself to remain calm and continued taking notes as if nothing had changed. But her mind was racing through tactical possibilities, exit strategies, and ways to approach an operative who might be under technological control without triggering a violent confrontation in a room full of civilians. When the presentation ended, Elena gathered her materials slowly, watching Subject 7 through peripheral vision. He stood and moved toward the exit with the easy confidence of someone who knew exactly where he was going and wasn't concerned about being followed. Elena waited until most of the audience had left before following, keeping enough distance to avoid immediate detection while staying close enough to track his movements. Subject 7 led her through the convention center's main corridors and into a cafe area that offered multiple exit routes and good sight lines for surveillance. He selected a table in a corner that would be difficult to approach without being observed, ordered coffee, and opened a newspaper with the casual efficiency of someone settling in for an extended observation period. Elena realized this was likely a deliberate test. Subject 7 had positioned himself where she could observe him, but not approach safely, forcing her to either reveal her intentions by making contact or abandon her surveillance, and lose the opportunity to assess his condition. It was exactly the kind of tactical thinking she would have employed in similar circumstances. She decided on a middle course. Elena purchased her own coffee and selected a table with clear sight lines to Subject 7's position, but far enough away to avoid immediate confrontation. She opened her laptop and began working on what appeared to be conference-related business, while actually using reflection in the screen to monitor his activities. For 30 minutes, both operatives maintained their positions in what amounted to a surveillance standoff. Subject 7 read his newspaper methodically, occasionally sipping his coffee, while Elena typed on her laptop and reviewed conference materials. To any outside observer, they would have appeared to be ordinary business travelers taking a break between sessions. The deadlock broke when Subject 7's behavior changed subtly. He closed his newspaper, checked his watch, and stood up with the kind of decisive movement that suggested he'd received new instructions or reached a predetermined decision point. Elena watched him dispose of his coffee cup and walk toward the convention center's main exit with purposeful stride. Elena faced a crucial choice. Following him outside would take her away from the controlled environment of the convention center and into unknown territory where an encounter could turn dangerous quickly. But letting him disappear would mean losing her only confirmed contact with one of the activated operatives. She chose to follow, gathering her equipment and trailing Subject 7 at maximum distance while he navigated through Berlin's afternoon crowds. His route took them away from the convention center and into older sections of the city where narrow streets and historic buildings provided numerous opportunities for ambush or escape. Subject 7's destination proved to be a small cafe in a quiet residential neighborhood, the kind of place that served local customers rather than tourists or business travelers. Elena watched from across the street as he entered the establishment, noting that he chose a table by the window where his presence would be visible to anyone conducting surveillance. Elena realized that Subject 7 was deliberately making himself available for contact while maintaining tactical advantages. The cafe's location made it difficult to approach without being observed, but his position by the window suggested he was willing to be seen and possibly approached under controlled circumstances. She spent several minutes observing the cafe and surrounding area, noting potential escape routes and identifying anyone else who might be conducting surveillance. The neighborhood appeared normal, with pedestrians and local residents going about their daily routines, but Elena's training made her suspicious of anything that appeared too ordinary. Finally, Elena decided to make contact. She crossed the street and entered the cafe, moving with the casual confidence of someone who belonged in the neighborhood. Subject 7 looked up when she entered, and for a moment, their eyes met directly for the first time. Elena felt a shock of recognition that went beyond his physical appearance. There was something in Subject 7's expression, a mixture of alertness, assessment, and what looked like relief, that suggested he'd been hoping for this contact as much as she had been seeking it. She approached his table slowly, keeping her hands visible and her posture non-threatening. "Mind if I join you?" Elena asked in English, though she was prepared to switch to German if necessary. Subject 7 gestured toward the empty chair across from him. "I was wondering when you'd finally introduce yourself," he replied, his voice carrying a slight American accent that surprised Elena. "You've been very patient with your surveillance." Elena sat down, noting that Subject 7's hands remained clearly visible on the table's surface, a sign that he was as concerned about avoiding confrontation as she was. "I wasn't sure whether you'd noticed me or if you were waiting for someone else. Hard not to notice someone with our training trying to track me through Berlin," Subject 7 said, with what might have been amusement. "The question is whether you're here officially or if you've gone freelance like the rest of us." Elena studied his face carefully, looking for signs of technological influence or abnormal behavior patterns. Subject 7 appeared alert and rational, showing none of the mechanical responses she'd been taught to recognize in compromised operatives. "Neither," Elena said carefully. "I'm here because people are concerned about what's been happening to our former colleagues." Subject 7's expression darkened. "Former colleagues? Is that what they're calling us now?" He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. "Do you know what happened to the others? The real story, not whatever official version you've been given." Elena felt a chill run down her spine. Subject 7's tone suggested he had information about the other operatives that contradicted everything Harrison's team had told her. "What do you mean, the real story?" "I mean that 6 of our former colleagues are dead," Subject 7 said quietly. "Really dead this time, not just officially dead. And the tracking signals everyone's been detecting? They're not coming from the original operatives." Elena felt like the ground was shifting beneath her feet. If Subject 7 was telling the truth, then the entire premise of her mission was based on false information. "How do you know this?" Subject 7 pulled a small device from his pocket, something that looked like a modified smartphone with additional electronic components. "Because I've been tracking the same signals you have, trying to find out what happened to people I trained with. What I found was that someone has been harvesting tracking implants from corpses and using them to create fake operational signatures. Elena stared at the device, recognizing some of the modification patterns from her own equipment. You're saying someone is using dead operatives' implants to fake their resurrection? More than that, Subject 7 said grimly. They're using the tracking data to conduct operations that will be blamed on our program if anyone investigates. Perfect way to discredit a classified project while accomplishing objectives that can't be traced to official government sources. Elena realized that her mission had been based on a fundamental misunderstanding of the situation. Instead of tracking rogue operatives who needed to be stopped, she'd been sent to investigate a sophisticated false flag operation designed to frame a terminated program for activities it had no involvement in. Who's behind it? Elena asked. Subject 7 checked his modified device, scanning for electronic surveillance before answering. That's what I've been trying to determine for the past 3 months. Someone with access to classified program files, knowledge of our training and capabilities, and resources to conduct global operations using stolen technology. Elena thought about the briefing she'd received from Harrison's team, wondering how much they really knew about the situation and how much they'd told her based on incomplete intelligence. The people who sent me here believe the other operatives have been reactivated and are conducting hostile operations. Your people are half right, Subject 7 said. Someone is conducting hostile operations using our identities and technology. But the operatives they think are responsible have been dead for months or years. Elena felt the familiar weight of incomplete information and shifting mission parameters that had defined her active duty years. Every answer revealed new questions, and the people she'd trusted to provide accurate intelligence seemed to have fundamental gaps in their understanding of the situation. Why are you here in Berlin? Elena asked. If you've been tracking this independently, what brought you to this specific location? Subject 7's expression became grim. Because one of the fake operational signatures originated from this city 3 days ago, coinciding with the theft of classified technology from a government research facility. Whoever is using our implants is escalating their activities, and I think Berlin is where they're planning something major. Elena realized that her mission had just become significantly more complex. Instead of tracking a single rogue operative, she was now dealing with a conspiracy that involved stolen classified technology, dead colleagues being framed for ongoing operations, and someone planning activities serious enough to require government-level resources. What kind of classified technology was stolen? Elena asked. Subject 7 showed her his device's screen, which displayed what appeared to be intelligence reports about the theft. Advanced encryption protocols for secure military communications. The kind of thing that could be used to intercept or fake orders from command authorities. Elena felt pieces of a larger puzzle clicking together in her mind. If someone had stolen military communication protocols and was using dead operatives' implants to fake operational signatures, they were positioning themselves to conduct operations that could be blamed on terminated programs while maintaining the ability to intercept or counterfeit official orders. They're planning something that requires military-level communication security, Elena said, understanding dawning like a cold sunrise. Something big enough that they need to ensure no one can trace it back to them or interfere with their operations. Subject 7 nodded grimly. And whatever they're planning, it's happening soon. The pattern of fake operational signatures suggests they're positioning assets for coordinated action within the next 48 hours. Elena realized that her mission had evolved from a simple tracking operation to a race against time to prevent something that could have international consequences. But first, she needed to understand who Subject 7 really was and why he'd been conducting his own investigation instead of reporting his findings to official authorities. Why haven't you contacted the people who sent me? Elena asked. If you have intelligence about this conspiracy, why work alone? Subject 7's expression became bitter. Because I'm not sure who can be trusted. Our program was terminated 3 years ago, but someone with inside access has been using classified information for unauthorized operations. The people who sent you here might be legitimate, or they might be part of the conspiracy. Elena felt the familiar paranoia of deep cover operations settling over her like a familiar coat. In the world of classified programs and terminated projects, it was never clear who was working for whom, and the people providing intelligence often had agendas that didn't align with official objectives. But as she looked at Subject 7's evidence and considered the implications of what he'd discovered, Elena realized that regardless of who could be trusted, stopping the conspiracy had become more important than determining which government officials were legitimate and which might be compromised. "What do you propose we do?" Elena asked. Subject 7 closed his device and looked directly at her, his expression carrying the weight of someone who'd been carrying dangerous knowledge alone for too long. "We find whoever is using our dead colleagues' identities and make sure they understand that some programs are harder to terminate than they expected." Elena felt something shift inside her chest, like machinery awakening after a long sleep. For the first time since her reactivation, she was working with someone who understood the stakes and had the training to operate in situations where normal rules didn't apply. Whatever came next would be dangerous, but it would also be familiar in ways that 3 years of training recruits had never been. As they left the cafe together, Elena realized that Subject 7 still hadn't told her his real name, and she hadn't offered hers. In the world they'd been trained for, names were just another kind of equipment that could be discarded when circumstances required. But as they began planning their next move, Elena found herself hoping that this partnership would last long enough for real introductions to matter. Subject 7 led Elena through Berlin's underground metro system to a safe house he'd established in an abandoned office building near the city's industrial district. The building had been scheduled for demolition that had been delayed by bureaucratic complications, making it perfect for temporary operations that needed to avoid official attention. His setup was impressive in its simplicity: basic surveillance equipment, secure communications gear, and detailed maps marking locations where fake operational signatures had been detected across multiple European cities. Elena recognized the methodical approach from her own training, but Subject 7's operation showed months of careful preparation rather than the hasty improvisation of someone working alone out of desperation. "My real name is David Chun," he said as they settled into the makeshift command center he'd created. "I was recruited for the program straight out of Army Special Forces, told I was being selected for deep cover operations that would protect American interests in regions too sensitive for official involvement." Elena studied the intelligence David had gathered, noting patterns that connected the fake operational signatures to a series of incidents that had destabilized European security cooperation over the past several months. Elena Vasquez. Similar recruitment story, though I came from Marine Force reconnaissance. David activated his monitoring equipment, showing Elena readouts that tracked multiple tracking signals across Central Europe. The signatures have been moving in a coordinated pattern toward Frankfurt over the past week. Whatever operation they're planning appears to be centered there. Elena examined the tracking data, recognizing the movement patterns from her own experience with multi-team operations. That's where the European Central Bank is located, and the American military's European Command Center, along with about a dozen other targets that could justify major international incidents if they were attacked by supposedly rogue American operatives, David said grimly. Perfect setup for someone who wants to damage American credibility while accomplishing objectives that serve other interests. Elena realized they were looking at a sophisticated false flag operation designed to frame a terminated American program for attacks that would have massive political consequences. The stolen military communication protocols would allow the conspirators to coordinate their operation while preventing legitimate authorities from interfering effectively. "We need to get to Frankfurt," Elena said. "But first, we need to know who we're really dealing with. Someone with this level of access and resources isn't working alone." David pulled up files on his laptop showing what appeared to be financial records and travel documents. "I've been tracking the logistics behind these operations, how equipment is moved, how safe houses are funded, how operational signatures are coordinated. The pattern suggests government-level resources, but without official oversight." Elena studied the documents, noting sophisticated money transfers and equipment purchases that required connections to military suppliers and intelligence agencies. Someone is using official channels for unofficial purposes. Question is whether they're acting independently or following orders from authorities we don't know about. Their planning was interrupted by an alert from David's monitoring equipment. New tracking signals had appeared in Frankfurt, but the patterns were different from the fake signatures they'd been following. These showed the irregular timing and movement characteristics of actual implants being carried by living operatives. "That's not possible," Elena said, staring at the readouts. You said the other operatives were dead. David checked his equipment calibration, confirming that the new signals were genuine. Either I was wrong about some of them being killed, or these are different operatives entirely. People with the same implant technology, but not part of the original 12. Elena felt a chill run down her spine as she considered the implications. If there were additional operatives with the same technology, it meant the program had been larger than she'd been told, or someone had continued developing operatives after the official termination. We need to get to Frankfurt immediately, Elena said. If there are live operatives involved, this situation is about to become much more dangerous. David began packing his equipment with practiced efficiency. There's something else you need to know. The communication intercepts I've been monitoring suggest this operation has official support from someone high up in either American or European command structures. Elena paused in her own packing, processing this information. How high up? High enough to access classified program files and authorize the use of terminated assets for ongoing operations, David replied. We're not just dealing with rogue operatives or stolen technology. Someone with serious authority is directing this conspiracy. Elena realized that their mission had evolved beyond stopping unauthorized operations to investigating potential treason at high levels of government. The people who'd sent her to Berlin might be legitimate, or they might be part of a conspiracy that extended into the highest levels of military and intelligence leadership. The train to Frankfurt gave them 3 hours to develop an operational plan and study intelligence about their targets. Elena and David established cover identities as business consultants conducting security assessments for multinational corporations, credentials that would justify their presence near high-value targets while providing reasonable explanations for sophisticated equipment. Frankfurt's financial district felt like a fortress designed to protect the institutions that managed European economic policy. Security was visible but professional, with the kind of layered defenses that suggested serious preparation for various threat scenarios. Elena noted multiple surveillance systems and checkpoint protocols that would make unauthorized access extremely difficult. David's monitoring equipment detected the live tracking signals coming from a luxury hotel near the European Central Bank, but the movement patterns suggested the operatives were conducting reconnaissance rather than preparing for immediate action. Elena realized they had a narrow window to investigate before whatever operation was planned moved to its execution phase. We need to identify who these operatives are before we approach them, Elena said. If they're under technological control, direct contact could trigger violent responses. David agreed, establishing surveillance positions that would allow them to observe the hotel without being detected by professional counter-surveillance teams. Their first view of the targets came that evening, when 2 men left the hotel and walked toward the financial district with the casual confidence of people familiar with the area. Elena recognized their movement patterns immediately, the systematic scanning, careful positioning, and situational awareness that marked professional operatives. But their age surprised her. Both men appeared to be in their 40s, older than anyone from the original program, should have been given the recruitment timelines she'd been told about. Those aren't from our program, Elena whispered to David as they observed from across the street. They're too old, and their training signatures are different. David checked his monitoring equipment, confirming that the tracking signals were coming from the men they were watching. Same implant technology, but different operational background. Military, but not special operations trained. Elena realized they were dealing with operatives from a parallel program she'd never been told about, people who'd been given the same technology but different training and mission parameters. The conspiracy was larger and more complex than either she or David had understood. Their surveillance was interrupted when one of the targets suddenly stopped walking and looked directly toward their position. Elena felt the familiar chill of being detected by someone with professional training, but the operative's reaction was unexpected. Instead of alerting his partner or taking defensive action, he approached their position with the deliberate stride of someone intending to make contact. He's coming over here, David muttered, preparing to disengage from their surveillance position. No, Elena said, studying the approaching operative's body language. He wants to talk. His posture isn't defensive. The operative reached their position and spoke quietly in accented English that suggested Eastern European background. You are the ones monitoring our communications. We need to speak privately. Elena and David exchanged glances, recognizing that their surveillance had been detected, but that the operative was offering cooperation rather than confrontation. They followed him to a nearby cafe where his partner was already waiting, having apparently coordinated the contact in advance. The second operative was older, perhaps 50, with the bearing of someone accustomed to command authority. When he spoke, his voice carried the crisp efficiency of military leadership. "I am Colonel Viktor Petrov, formerly of Soviet Special Operations, currently attempting to prevent an international incident that will be blamed on people like us." Elena felt pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place. "You're not working with the people using fake operational signatures. We are hunting them," Colonel Petrov replied. "Just as you are, but with better intelligence about who is directing this conspiracy." David leaned forward, his monitoring equipment still active beneath the table. "What intelligence?" The younger operative, who had introduced himself as Captain Alexei Volkov, pulled out what appeared to be official documents bearing government seals Elena didn't recognize. 3 months ago, we were contacted by someone claiming to represent joint American-Russian intelligence cooperation. We were told that former operatives from both programs were conducting unauthorized operations and needed to be stopped. Elena realized that she and David weren't the only ones who'd been sent to investigate the conspiracy. Multiple governments were dealing with similar problems involving terminated programs and rogue operatives, suggesting a coordination that went beyond simple criminal activity. "Who contacted you?" Elena asked. Colonel Petrov's expression became grim. "Someone with access to classified files from both American and Russian programs. Someone who knew details about operations that were never officially recorded." Elena felt a chill run down her spine. If the conspiracy included people with access to multiple nations' classified programs, they were dealing with coordination at the highest levels of international intelligence cooperation. "We believe," Captain Volkov continued, "that this conspiracy is being directed by General Marcus Patterson, currently serving as NATO Deputy Supreme Allied Commander for Intelligence." Elena felt like she'd been hit by a physical blow. General Patterson's name had appeared in her original program files as someone involved in operational oversight, but she'd never met him directly. If he was directing the conspiracy, it meant someone with legitimate authority was using terminated programs for unauthorized purposes. "Patterson has access to classified files from multiple programs," Colonel Petrov explained. "He was involved in the original development of implant technology and would know how to harvest devices from deceased operatives." David checked his monitoring equipment, noting that additional tracking signals were appearing across Frankfurt. "Whatever he's planning is entering its final phase. We're running out of time to stop it." Elena realized that stopping the conspiracy would require confronting someone with the authority to classify their actions as treason and the resources to eliminate them if they became too much of a threat. But the alternative was allowing an operation that could destabilize international relations and potentially start conflicts between nations that believed they were responding to attacks by each other's operatives. "Where is Patterson now?" Elena asked. Captain Volkov consulted his own device, showing tracking data that located Patterson's position at NATO headquarters in Brussels. "He's been coordinating what appears to be a major intelligence operation, but outside normal command channels." Elena understood that confronting Patterson would require evidence that could convince other NATO officials of his involvement in unauthorized operations. But gathering that evidence would mean infiltrating facilities where her presence would be considered an act of espionage by allied nations. "We need to coordinate our approach," Elena said. "If Patterson's suspects were investigating him, he'll accelerate whatever operation he's planning." Colonel Petrov nodded agreement. "We propose a joint operation. Your technical capabilities combined with our intelligence about Patterson's activities. But we must move tonight, before his operation reaches a point where stopping it becomes impossible." Elena looked at David, recognizing that they were being asked to trust operatives from a former enemy nation in order to stop a conspiracy directed by their own military leadership. The irony would have been amusing if the stakes weren't potentially catastrophic. "What's the plan?" David asked. Captain Volkov spread maps across the cafe table, showing NATO headquarters and surrounding facilities. "Patterson is scheduled to attend a classified briefing tomorrow morning about European security threats. The briefing will include intelligence officials from multiple nations, perfect targets if Patterson wants to eliminate people who might investigate his activities. Elena realized that the conspiracy wasn't just about conducting false flag operations. It was about silencing the people who might uncover the truth. Patterson was positioning himself to eliminate investigators while framing terminated programs for attacks that would justify increased security measures and expanded authority for people like himself. He's planning to kill intelligence officials and blame it on rogue operatives, Elena said, understanding the full scope of Patterson's plan. Perfect way to consolidate power while eliminating oversight. Colonel Petrov confirmed her assessment. And, if successful, the resulting security crackdown would give him authority to terminate any investigations into his previous activities. Elena stood up, feeling the familiar weight of a mission that could change everything settling on her shoulders. For years, she'd been told that her program was terminated and that her services were no longer needed. But, looking at the evidence of Patterson's conspiracy, she realized that some programs were too dangerous to be truly terminated as long as people like him retained access to their capabilities. "We stop him tonight," Elena said, her voice carrying the tone she'd used during her most dangerous missions. "Whatever it takes." As they left the cafe to prepare for their infiltration of NATO headquarters, Elena caught sight of her reflection in a window and noticed something that made her heart race. The small scar on her shoulder blade, the mark left by her implant surgery, was visible above her jacket collar. For the first time in 3 years, Elena Vasquez wasn't hiding her identity as a supposedly dead operative. She was about to confront the person responsible for her fake death, and she wanted him to recognize exactly who was coming for him. The has-been soldier was about to show General Patterson why some people were much harder to eliminate than their files suggested. The secret emblem that had defined her existence for 15 years was about to become the last thing Patterson saw before understanding that declaring Elena Vasquez dead had been the biggest mistake of his career.